Thanks a lot, Martin. I'm really pleased to be with you today. Richard, if you don't mind sharing the presentation, please. Thank you. So my presentation is entitled Catholic and Ash'ari Ideas of Salvation, which is basically the central theme of my first book entitled A History of Catholic and Ash'ari Theologies of Truth and Salvation. Richard, if you don't mind moving the slide. Great. That's basically the cover photo of the book, A Comparative History of Catholic and Ash'ari Theologies of Truth and Salvation, Inclusive Minorities, Exclusive Majorities, published with Brill almost 8 months ago. So if I may begin with basically the motivations that encouraged me to study the question of salvation in the Islamic tradition. My mind has been occupied with this question since I was a student at Al-Azhar, almost doing my undergraduate studies almost 10 or 11 years ago. As part of our curriculum at Al-Azhar, we have part of the curriculum is basically involves going through the Quranic verses that tackle non-Islamic religions. And often the verse, which is verse 85 of the 3rd chapter of the Quran, which says, وَمَنْ يَبْتَغِ غَيْرَ الْإِسْلَامِ دِينًا فَلَنْ يُقْبَلَ مِنْهُ وَهُوَ فِي الْآخِرَةِ مِنَ الْخَاسِرِينَ. And whoever desires other than Islam, apologies, as religion, never will it be accepted from him, and he in the hereafter will be among the losers. So this verse would often be quoted as the proof that Islam sees itself as the only valid path to salvation. However, the next verse in the slide here, verse 62 of chapter Surah Al-Baqarah, always ruffled my feathers. The verse says, indeed, those who believed and those who were Jews or Christians or Sabians, those who believed in God and last day and did good will have the reward with their Lord, and no fear will there be concerning them, nor they grieve. This verse would often be sidelined from the discussion by two strategies that would often be raised. The first one is what can be called the particularization, by which scholars would say that what is meant by the Jews and Christians and Sabians here are not the existing Jews and Christians, but rather those who lived before the advent of Prophet Muhammad. And this verse would primarily be particularized by hadith such as the following hadith, the one that says, by him in whose hand Muhammad's soul is, any one of these people, Jew or Christian, who hears of me and then dies without believing in my message will be among those who go to hell. So the first strategy used to particularize the generality of verse 62 of chapter of the 2nd chapter of the Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, would often be particularized in this way. What is meant by Christians or Jews here are those who lived before Prophet Muhammad. The second strategy would be to say that this verse has been abrogated or superseded by the preceding verse, which is verse 85 of Surah Al-Imran, the 3rd chapter of the Quran, and whoever desires other than Islam as religion will be among the losers. But at that time, I was not really satisfied with those answers. And I always wanted, because I come from a school that basically a preach that basically that does not allow that type of particularization of something that the text makes general. If God had meant if God had meant that it's what is meant here is Jews and Christians before who lived before Muhammad, the verse could have said so. But the very fact that the verse left that very general is quite telling. So I wasn't really satisfied with the very idea of particularization, as I also come from the Hanafi school, which is follows that strategy, letting the general verses as they are without particularizing them by any other methods. On the other hand, I always looked at the theory of supersessionism or abrogation with a pinch of salt. I barely take it as an authentic or as a legitimate tool of reading the Quranic or the Islamic tradition. So I wasn't really satisfied with those answers. And since then, the question of salvation always occupied my mind. When I came to the UK in 2013 to do my master's in Catholic theology at the University of Durham, we had a module on the area of theology of religions. This area basically attempts to evaluate the phenomena of religions from a given religious tradition. Say from the Christian tradition, how does Christianity sees non-Christian religions? How does Islam see non-Islamic religions in terms of validity and its effectiveness in terms of salvation? So there I was introduced to the different schools on this area, meaning pluralism, inclusivism, and exclusivism. Those are the most dominant schools in this area. By exclusivism, we basically refer to the belief that only one faith tradition is the valid and authentic path that leads to salvation. Pluralism is the belief that basically multiple religious traditions are equally valid and equally effective in terms of leading to salvation. And inclusivism is somewhere in between. It gives some sort of superiority to a certain faith tradition, but it does not believe that non-Christian or non-Islamic traditions have no elements of truth. So it's somewhere in the middle, in between exclusivism and pluralism. But when I came to study at Durham, I was also introduced to different Muslim views on those questions. Victor, if we may move to the next slide. So that's basically what we call the intellectual motivations. I was introduced to Muslims who negate the very idea of having a concept of salvation in Islam. One of the key theologians who believe in this idea was Ismail Raji al-Faruqi, who was a renowned Muslim academic in the US, who argued that in the Islamic view, human beings are no more fallen than they are saved. Because they are not fallen, they have no need for a savior. But because they are not saved either, they need to do good works and do them ethically, which alone will earn them the desired salvation. Indeed, salvation is an improper term. An improper term, since to need salvation, one must be in a predicament beyond the hope of ever escaping it. But men and women are not in that predicament. Humans are not ethically powerless. They are not helpless puppets, capable of neither good nor evil. They are capable of both. So we see from this quotation that al-Faruqi, representing one of the most dominant views in this question, he rejects the very idea of having a theory of salvation in the Islamic tradition as such. And that's basically one of the most dominant views on this area. The next slide, please. But Muhammad Hassan Khalil, whose book Islam and the Fate of the Others is one of the most groundbreaking books in the field, basically goes against Ismail al-Faruqi's argument. He argues that salvation is arguably the major theme of the Quran. The frequent claim that Islam has no concept of salvation because it has no doctrine of original sin is true only if we assume a narrow definition of salvation. When discussing eschatological reward and punishment, it is customary for Muslim theologians to employ the Quranic term najah, and is typically, and for good reason, translated as salvation or deliverance. So Muhammad Hassan Khalil, as we see, argues that that salvation is arguably the major theme of the Quran. So here we have almost two opposing views on this question. Since then, I basically tried to trace the most significant attempts that tried to read the Islamic tradition through the typology of exclusivism, inclusivism, and pluralism, to see how they essentially see the Islamic tradition, whether it is pluralistic or exclusivistic or inclusivistic. The next slide, please. So I came across three key attempts that tried to study the question of salvation in Islam. The first one is basically Rifat Attai, who had his PhD from St. Andrews in 1999, entitled Religious Pluralism and Islam. There he studies Abu Mansur al-Maturidi, who is the eponymous founder of the Maturidi school, which is one of the key Sunni schools of theology. And he argues that exclusivism is the most dominant view, the most dominant Islamic view in terms of salvation. And he contends that 95% of Muslims would believe so. And he studies Abu Mansur al-Maturidi as a key theologian who represents this paradigm. Muhammad Hassan Khalil, in his Islam and the Fate of Others, argues, he goes against Rifat Attai to say that it is not exclusivism that better reflects the Islamic view of salvation, but rather inclusivism. To do so, Khalil studies primarily four key theologians: Al-Ghazali, Ibn Arabi, Ibn Taymiyyah, and Rashid Rida, and others, to say that even though those different theologians, those towering theologians, come from different theological schools, they all ended up, in a way or another, arguing for the possibility of salvation for non-Muslims. Al-Ghazali coming from the Ash'ari tradition, Ibn Arabi from the Sufi tradition, Ibn Taymiyyah coming from the Athari tradition or the Hanbali tradition, and Rashid Rida comes from a Salafi tradition. So Khalil's key argument against Rifat Attai is that inclusivism is rather the most dominant view in the Islamic tradition, not exclusivism. The most recent attempt to study the Islamic views in this is the Turkish academic Isra Dak, in her book published with Routledge, Christian and Islamic Theology of Religions. There she argued that inclusivism as such doesn't exist in the Islamic tradition, but we either have exclusivism or pluralism. She studies some contemporary scholars, including Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad, Tim Winter, and Yasir Qadi as examples of exclusivists or believers in exclusivism, and studies, on the other hand, Hassan al-Askari, Farid Ishaq, and Rida Shah Kadhimi as examples of Muslim pluralists. That is to say that the Islamic tradition can be read either as an exclusivist or a pluralist tradition, but inclusivism as such doesn't exist there. Despite the fact that those studies have really introduced a lot to the area of the Islamic theology of salvation, none of these studies looked at the theological schools. So they basically have attempted to study individual theologians rather than studying theological schools. This is basically where my key contribution lies. I attempted to study the most dominant school in Islamic theology, which is Ash'arism, to basically see how Muslims or the Muslim theologians of this dominant school thought about this question at an intra-faith and an interfaith level. So one of the key aims that I had is to move the discussion from individual theologians to theological schools, to basically be more reflective, to try and be more reflective of the tradition, rather than basing the Islamic tradition on certain theologians, no matter how influential they were. One other issue that I had with those studies is that they basically send the impression that the Islamic tradition was static, and that Muslims thought about this question all the time in the very same way. And this is something that I don't really think was the case. There is a sense of dynamism that accompanied the Muslim discussion of salvation in early Islam, which differs from how they looked at the question in classical Islam and even though and also from in modern Islam. So that's what led me to write in my book on Ash'arism rather than individual theologians. And given my interest in the Christian tradition, more particularly the Catholic tradition, I was really interested in also studying how Catholic theologians thought about those questions in comparison to the Muslim theologians, the Ash'ari theologians, given that the two schools, Catholicism and Ash'arism, are arguably the most dominant schools in the two traditions. Richard, if I may move, please. So basically, there is no way for me to cover all the points or the conclusions that I had in the book, but I'll focus on one of the key conclusions I reached in this monograph. The point I want to focus on is one of the key conclusions that I reached, which is, while the Ash'ari theology of salvation witnessed some sort of a theological development that was hadith-based in the early phase of Ash'arism, and if you look down here, you will find that I periodized the monograph into 3 periods: formative, medieval, classical, and then modern. And these are the rough years that I consider as defining moments in the history of those two traditions. So I argue that while the Ash'ari theology had some sort of a theological development, moving from being hadith-based and then followed by a period that I term as Sunnah-based, ending with what I call a Quran-based theology of salvation, the Catholic journey or the Catholic discussion of salvation differed from the Ash'ari journey. That is to say that the Catholic tradition, I argued, had some sort of a theological contest between exclusivism and inclusivism since its early phase. In what follows, I will explain how this happens. Richard, please. So here I argue that in the Catholic tradition, it appears that there were two schools in early Christianity that attempted to define how Christians should relate to the non-Christian religions with which Christianity came into contact. These are what I call the exclusivists and the inclusivists, or inclusivism and exclusivism. Here I studied briefly a good number of early church fathers who were quite influential in defining the early Christian theology of salvation. And the first chapter of the book is primarily focused on this period, attempting to illustrate how those two schools had that type of rivalry in the attempt to define how Christianity should relate to non-Christian religions. The attitude of the early church fathers towards other religions can be briefly summarized in these points. The fathers were often more sanguine about the possibility of salvation for Jews and Gentiles who had lived before Christ than later theologians. The fathers nevertheless denied the possibility of salvation for those Christians who caused schism and dissent in the church, and that it was only towards the end of the 4th century when Christianity became the official state religion, and that the axiom, no salvation outside the church, began to be applied to pagans and Jews. As I said, throughout the first 300 years of early Christianity, the inclusivist school seems to have had a louder voice in terms of defining how Christianity should relate to non-Christian religions. And what I mean by inclusivism here, not that Christianity recognized non-Christian religions as salvifically valid, but rather to say that the word of God made flesh and embodied in Jesus Christ, the seeds of this word were spread and dispersed into the universe. Therefore, those non-Christians, if they will be saved through Christ, not despite Christ. Otherwise, early Christians would be classified as pluralists, which is not the case. But this is to differentiate between this school of inclusivism and the exclusivist school, which basically saw no value in non-Christian religions whatsoever. If we may move, Richard, please. This remained the case since the 4th century of Christianity. The slogan of outside the church, there is no salvation, remained basically the dominant view throughout medieval Christianity. And here I studied in the book quite deeply St. Augustine's view of salvation. And then I studied also St. Thomas Aquinas' view of salvation, with some slight differences between Aquinas and Augustine in terms of classifying Augustine as having some sort of a heavy exclusivism as compared to Aquinas' light exclusivism, if you wish. I argue that throughout this period, this slogan, this exclusivist slogan, there is no salvation outside the church, was the official and the most dominant view of the Catholic Church. And I studied to bridge the gap between Aquinas and the modern theologians. I studied like almost like 7 or 8 theologians briefly to show the extent to which Aquinas influenced post-Thomistic theologians and post-Thomistic Catholicism in how it views non-Catholic traditions and non-Christian traditions. Until Vatican II, which basically, I argue, it revived the inclusivist interpretation of the Christian tradition, which basically argued for the possibility of salvation of non-Christians. One of the key statements of the documents of Vatican II states, but the plan of salvation also includes those who acknowledge the Creator in the first place, among whom are the Muslims. These profess to hold the faith of Abraham and together with us adore the one merciful God, mankind's judge on the last day. In the third part, where I focus on modern Catholicism, I looked at 2 key Catholic theologians who, in a way or another, influenced Vatican II's statements on Islam and Judaism, meaning the 20th century Catholic theologian Karl Rahner, who died in 1984, and Louis Massonin, who died in 1962. In the third part, or the third chapter on the Catholic section of my book, focuses mainly on the contributions of those 2 and how they viewed Islam in terms of its effectiveness in the area of salvation. I personally take Vatican II as not as a theological development in the Catholic view of salvation, but rather as revivification of a classical interpretation that existed in early Christianity. That is to say, or to confirm the point that I started with, that Christianity had some sort of a theological contest between exclusivism and inclusivism since its early phase. And I'm really sorry that I'm not really going into details due to the limitations of the time. But if we may move to the Asharite or the Ashari section, we see the development that happened in the Ashari tradition, and probably in Islamic theology as a whole. As it began with what I call the denomination-based salvation, what is in Arabic would be called al-firqa al-najiyah, based on this hadith that says the Jews split into 71 sects, one of which will be in paradise and 70 in hell. The Christians split into 72 sects, 71 of which will be in hell and 1 in paradise. I swear by the one in whose hand is the soul of Muhammad, my nation will split into 73 sects, one of which will be in paradise and 72 in hell. This hadith has largely encouraged early Asharites to have some sort of a denomination-based understanding of not only salvation but also truth. So the hadith encouraged the early Asharites to have the view that it's just one Muslim denomination that have an authentic interpretation of the tradition. And the hadith was taken for granted in terms of its authority and authenticity, until it was largely questioned by Al-Ghazali. And that's why I take Al-Ghazali as constituting a milestone in the Ash'ari tradition in that sense, where I call his contribution to the discussion as the Sunnah-based salvation. As Al-Ghazali here and post-Ghazali and Ash'arism in general took more of a Sunnah-based approach to the question of salvation, in the sense that instead of relying on one key hadith as defining the paradigm of the epistemic paradigm of salvation, Al-Ghazali consulted a wide range of hadiths to basically inform his view of salvation and the following Ash'ari theologians. But yet Al-Ghazali did not depart from taking the Sunnah as a key source for the identification of the Muslim theology of salvation, because he, as he would say in Al-Mustasfa, his book in Islamic legal theory, makes it clear that he sees the Sunnah as per se as a piece of revelation, which can be compared to the Quran in the sense that both are pieces of revelation, while the difference is the Quran is a recited revelation, while the Sunnah is an unrecited revelation. So Al-Ghazali, in multiple works of his, would consult various hadiths constituting his understanding of the Sunnah and how it tackles the question of salvation. But there is barely engagement with the Quran and its those verses with which I started the discussion here. So one of the key hadiths that Al-Ghazali would mention is, by him in whose hand Muhammad's soul is, and one of these people, Jew or Christian, who he is of me and then dies without believing in my message, will be among those who go to hell. Al-Ghazali had a problem, obviously, with the previous hadith, with the 73 scheme. He questioned its not only its authority, but also its authenticity, arguing that the hadith is not narrated neither in Bukhari nor in Muslim. These are the two most authentic books of hadith in the Islamic tradition. And apart from that, the hadith is narrated in multiple narrations, and sometimes it's even opposing narrations. One of the narrations would say even the opposite, that 72 groups will be in paradise and only one would be in hell. So having questioned the authenticity of the hadith, its authority became quite limited, and therefore Al-Ghazali started to widen his resources and look at the Sunnah as a whole in terms of defining what constitutes the Muslim view on salvation. In very brief terms, he ended up placing Prophet Muhammad in the heart of the Islamic paradigm, replacing the denomination-based view. So for him, Prophet Muhammad would be the focal point that defines whether one, if you believe in Prophet Muhammad, if you believe in Prophet Muhammad, you may be called a believer, and believing in Prophet Muhammad would be the defining moment, the defining point that defines who a Muslim is, and on the basis of which Al-Ghazali excluded certain groups from the realm of Islam, again on the basis of taking this approach. I apologize, I'm being very generic here, as it will be quite difficult to cover all what Al-Ghazali says here. I'm just trying to give the general ideas that he contributed to the discussion. And I also studied here how Al-Ghazali's view influenced post-Ghazalian Ash'arites, briefly looking at Fakhruddin al-Razi, as-Suyuti, and Aduddin al-Iji as key Ash'ari theologians and exegetes who grappled with this question and moved, departing from the denomination-based salvation. that is to say, the Ghazalian view remained the standard Ash'ari view on salvation until modern times. If we may move, please, Richard. The third move, which I call the Quran-based salvation, is basically reflected in Abdu's school of theology. I consider this as a second move in the Ash'ari tradition, where Muhammad Abdu, probably the most influential modern Muslim scholar, basing his theology of salvation primarily on the Quran. That's the reason I call it a Quran-based salvation. Not that he rejects the Sunnah as such, but rather that he reads the Sunnah in the light of the Quran, and takes the Quranic verses as his definers of what constitutes the Islamic theology of salvation. So if we read Tafsir al-Manar or Majallat al-Manar, Risalat al-Tawheed, these are his keywords, his key books, he would often appeal to the very verse with which we started, the verse 62 of Surah al-Baqarah. That would be one of his key verses in the Quran that he appeals to in order to say that it shouldn't be Prophet Muhammad, meaning he shouldn't be at the heart of the Muslim theology of salvation, but rather Allah or God should be at the heart of the Muslim theology of salvation. Therefore, Abdu became so cautious with naming non-Muslim believers, most notably Jews, Christians, whoever believes in God. He became so cautious on naming them as kafirs. So he would take the term kafir to refer to someone who is an atheist today, while in the pre-Abdu's time, a kafir is someone who doesn't believe in Prophet Muhammad. As simple as that. One of the key verses to which Abdu would appeal to is verses 123, 125 of fourth chapter of the Quran. The verses were revealed according to At-Tabari when a group of Christians, Jews, and Muslims were arguing on the question of salvation, each believing that his faith tradition is the only valid path to salvation, and therefore the verses were revealed in response. The verses say, "It will not be according to your hopes or those of the people of the book," meaning Jews and Christians. "Anyone who does wrong will be requited for it and will find no one to protect or help him against God. Anyone, male or female, who does good deeds and is a believer will enter paradise and will not be wronged by as much as the dip in a date stone. Who could be better in religion than those who direct themselves wholly to God, do good, and follow the religion of Abraham, who was true in faith? God took Abraham as a friend." Abdu takes this verse as one of the key verses defining his theology of salvation. And then with this quotation from Abdu's genre in one of his epistles, he says, Richard, could you move, please? The last slide. He says, "I was in venerable Jerusalem to visit the holy places which the people of the three religions unitedly exalt. The visitor notices," meaning himself, "the visitor notices in these places that it is as if there is one family tree, that is the true religion, ad-din al-haq, from which numerous twigs branch out. Its unity in type and character and the singularity of its origin are not impaired by the visitor's observations of the variety of the tree's leaves, or the splitting of its branches. The visitor decides, furthermore, on the similarity of the tree's fruit, identical in color and flavor. It has been concentrated in the Islamic religion, which draws from all of the tree's roots and its stems. Thus, the Islamic religion is its epitome and the destination where its course ended. this basically reflects how Abdu saw how Islam relates to Christianity and Judaism. And this God-based theology, or the Quran-based theology that Abdu introduced to Al-Azhar, and that's one of the key reasons I've studied Abdu as an Ash'ari theologian, which is in and of itself a contested and a controversial matter. I know many scholars already argue that Abdu has departed from the Ash'ari tradition. I argue that such is not the case. I take Abdu as a critical Ash'arite, and that he, even though he opts out of the Ash'ari tradition in terms of in certain theological questions, he is still methodologically an Ash'arite, especially when we look at the key question in terms of methodology that defines the Ash'ari tradition and makes it distinct from other Muslim schools is the question of the relation between aql and naql, the reason versus revelation dichotomy. Here, Abdu follows to the letter the Ash'ari perspective, and I take this as a key thing that defines Abdu's relation to the Ash'ari tradition. The last part of the book looks at the reception of Abdu's theology, how Azhari scholars received his theology. I studied two grand imams of Al-Azhar, Abdul Halim Mahmud and Mahmud Shaltut, as two key theologians who were influenced by Abdu in a way or another. They were influenced by him in the sense that they both appealed to the Quran in the first place in defining the theology of salvation, but they ended up with different conclusions, with Mahmud Shaltut being some sort of an Abrahamic theologian, while Abdul Halim Mahmud would remain Ghazalian in terms of seeing Prophet Muhammad as constituting the heart of the Islamic theology of salvation, and adhering to the pre-Abdu's Muhammadan theology, if you wish. So it's with that's one of the key arguments that I make in the book. To reiterate, I argued one of the 6 key conclusions I reached in the book is that while the Ash'ari theology of salvation witnessed some sort of a theological development from hadith-based to sunnah-based to being a Quran-based theology, the Catholic theology had a different journey with that sort of differentiation between exclusivism and exclusivism since early Christianity. And therefore, I don't take the Vatican II as departing from the tradition, but rather reviving a more inclusivist approach. Many other conclusions I reached in the book, but unfortunately there is no time to cover these up. I hope this was of some use, and I'm more than happy to receive any questions you may have.